Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to today's seminar, and thanks for joining us in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today we have a really interesting presentation on the results from the recently released Youth Victimisation and Harm report. And our speakers are Laura Adlam and Patrick Neilands, who are analysts in the Research and Evaluation Sector Insights team at the Ministry of Justice. And they were part of the team who produced this report. So it's great to have them here to speak to us about their findings. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm really interested to see what came out of it. Over to you, Laura and Patrick.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming along. We'll just be talking through our kind of key results today, and then a couple of slightly deeper dives we did, looking at some kind of interesting topics. So the Youth Victimisation Harm report, we're kind of in an interesting position. Normally, our bread and butter is working on the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey, which is a survey we kind of own and manage with Ipsos to do the data collection. In this case, however, we weren't responsible for the data collection. The Ministry of Social Development, MSD, were kind of collecting data for their Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey, and they were kind enough to work with us to get some youth victimisation questions on the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey. That includes some questions that are already there and some kind of additional questions that were included. And then they, once they collected the data, they would give us a unit level data set for us to do our own analysis on. So we'll be kind of reporting on that analysis, but we'll just give a quick overview of what the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey is. So it's New Zealand's largest nationally represented survey of young people aimed at understanding youth health and wellbeing, as the name suggests. There's been a couple of iterations. There was the Youth 2000 survey that was run by the University of Auckland that kind of surveyed, I think, mostly the Upper North Island. And then that MSD took on running that with the What About Me survey in 2023 that aimed to be nationally representative. And then the Youth Health and Wellbeing survey is the latest iteration of that. So they made some additional changes. So from MSD's perspective, this is kind of starting a new time series again. But there are some questions that have kind of continued throughout since Youth 2000. So there's some comparisons that can be made, but just some changes in survey methodology. They just are a bit wary about making too many comparisons. So that's why for this report, we've been mostly focusing just on the 2026 data. Let's see what we have here. So it was conducted in the school year 2025. It does cover a wide range of topics on well-being, home experience, mental health, social media use, harmful behaviours, and kind of pertinently for us for victimisation. They collected data from around 9,400 young people, aged between the ages of 13 to 19. Although our data, because there wasn't that many 19-year-olds, our data really just looks at 13 to 18-year-olds. And the main findings were released by MSD on the 26th of March. They have a nice infographic, which is available on their website. And so our report hopes to further explore the data by drawing more deeply on the victimization-specific side of the data. We've looked firstly at kind of bullying, verbal harm, physical harm, and sexual harm. And we've also looked at two key stories. One is the impact of victimization on screen use and social media use and kind of that reciprocal relationship. And then a second story that looks like the impact of victimization and the involvement with state care and how that kind of works together, how that impacts on future offending. But before we kind of get into the details of the report, there's just some kind of caveats that come from working a well-being survey rather than a victimization survey. For one thing, we call it the Victimisation Harm report rather than abuse, and that's mostly coming from a justice sector background. We feel abuse has kind of a kind of criminogenic kind of definition, that because we don't have victim incident statements, because we can't really explore these offences in greater detail, we're a bit wary of just labeling as abuse. That doesn't mean that these actions aren't abusive, but just kind of within justice sector context, we feel like harm's a slightly safer label. That's not to deny the reality that a lot of these are abusive actions. And I guess the other thing is that when we work in New Zealand kind of victimisation survey, we're really using victim in a justice sense. So again, it's if we think that somebody's experienced an offence that really falls under the criteria of a criminal action, that's when they get the label victim. And Youth Health and Wellbeing survey, we've taken victimisation in a much more social idea of, so it's just a general experience of harm. You're a victim of harm without really having to worry about if that meets like a legal definition of a crime or offence. And so it's a slightly broader understanding of victimisation.
So as Paddy mentioned, the report's kind of split in two, where we go through the top line and demographic results for 4 different types of harm. So that's what we'll go through first. Just before going into the data, I know that all of you have already read the bio, but just reiterating that we're talking about young people's experiences with harm, which is never a very nice topic, but we've tried to, treat it as sensitively as possible. So the first topic that we talk through in the report relates to bullying. So a quarter of young people experienced bullying in the last 12 months, 26% of young people. Of young people who were bullied, the most common types of bullying that these young people experienced were teasing and exclusion, so over half of young people experienced those, followed by bullied, rumours being spread about them, for example, on social media, which is 41%, while the least common types of bullying were physical harm and pushing. And we had, 29% reported skipping school at least once in the last 12 months due to fear of being bullied. So when we're looking at these young people who were bullied, bullying decreased with age. So 13 to 14-year-olds were more likely than 15 to 18-year-olds to report being bullied. European young people also were more likely to experience bullying of the ethnic groups that we looked at, which were European, Māori, Pacific young people, and Asian young people. So this was most common in Europeans. Young people who identified as rainbow were about twice as likely than non-rainbow youth to report experience bullying, so 41% compared to 24%. Same with disabled young people, were twice as likely compared to non-disabled youth, 46% compared to 22%. And young people living in Canterbury were reported the highest rates of bullying when broken into the large regions, which is Auckland, Wellington, Canterbury, rest of the North Island, rest of the South Island. However, as we go into in the report, there are some large confidence intervals that we do just have to keep in mind specific to the regional breakdowns there. Interestingly, male and female young people reported quite similar rates of bullying. So this was 25% and 27% respectively, but they experienced bullying differently. Female young people were more likely to experience exclusion, rumours being spread about them, and bullying via messaging or over the phone compared to males, whereas males were more likely than females to experience pushing and physical harm. And then our second section of the report, we talk about verbal harm. So this is where young people are asked about their experiences of an adult yelling or swearing at in the places where they usually live. So 50% of young people experienced this directed at themselves. They experienced being yelled at or sworn at by adults in their home. 1/3 of young people witnessed adults verbally harming another adult, and 29% witnessed adults yelling at another child other than themselves. So we've got a measure of direct exposure as well as witnessing there. But when we specifically look at that 50% of young people who experienced it themselves, of those young people, we saw the opposite compared to bullying, which is that this was more common in older young people, in 15 to 18-year-olds compared to 13 to 14-year-olds. Female young people were also more likely than males. Young people identified as rainbow were more likely than non-rainbow young people. Disabled young people were more likely to experience verbal harm compared to non-disabled young people. And young people living with a single parent had the highest rates of verbal harm among the household composition that we looked at. And then again, we looked at it across the regions, but this was very, very similar across the region, 1 or 2 percentage point differences in there.
Yes, these probably touch on slightly more uncomfortable topics, physical harm and sexual harm. But starting with the physical harm, one thing we see is that about 11% of young people are exposed to some violence in the home. So about 7% of young people are themselves physically hurt by an adult they live with. Another 5% witness an adult hurting another child, and about 3% witness an adult physically harming one another. And obviously these categories aren't mutually exclusive. So one young person might be getting physical hurt and also witnessing harm to other individuals in the home as well. As well as asking about exposure to violence in the home, we also ask if the young person has experienced any direct physical harm in any context, in the home or otherwise, and that's broken down by relationship. So 49% of young people have been physically hit on purpose by somebody they know. For most young people, that's their sibling, that's about 41%, but also other peers occupy another 23% of that. About 11% are parent and caregiver, about 6% are a partner, and about 4% are another adult. So these are smaller than siblings, but still concerning and kind of in line with what you see with the percentages for the exposure to violence at home. And then when we break that down by demographics, so this is people who are likely to experience physical harm, we see that 13 to 14-year-olds are more likely to experience any type of harm. That's including from caregivers, from young people, other young people, from partners, from siblings. That Pacific young people are particularly likely to report physical harm, except for partner violence, which is highest for Māori young people. Male young people more likely to report one-off and repeated harm by a partner. Rainbow are a bit more likely to experience physical abuse, about 10% versus 7%. Disabled young people are much more likely, about 14% versus 6%. And that what we see, which is a pattern that we've seen kind of coming through, is that young people living in two-parent households are consistently report the lowest levels of physical harm, whereas single-parent households report much higher levels of physical harm. And then the final kind of top-line measure we were looking at was sexual harm. This one's a little bit different in how we measured this. For the other three categories, this was, have you experienced any of these acts in the previous 12 months? For the sexual harmers, have you experienced any of these in a lifetime? Just so that means that the 12-month reports would probably be lower than the percentages that we report. But we have about 16% have experienced sexual harm in their lifetime. And we define sexual harm as an experience of unwanted sexual touching or coercion, or an experience of harmful sexting. And we look at those categories, about 13% have experienced unwanted sexual touching or coercion, and another 7% have experienced unwanted and harmful sexting. We also have a third question, which is pressure to do things experienced, are they seen in pornography? We didn't wrap this into the broader sexual harm question because it's a little bit different. It doesn't ask about, there's not the same perpetrator-victim relationship. They could be getting that pressure, kind of like a social peer pressure, or just a sense of everybody's doing this. It's kind of hard to break that down to an offender-victim relationship in the same way we have for the other questions. Obviously, we kept that one separate, but we see about 5% of young people have felt that pressure to do things they've seen in pornography. And again, when we kind of look at these demographics, we see that older young people, so 15 to 18-year-olds, are about twice as likely to have experienced sexual harm than younger young people, 13 to 14-year-olds. It's about 20% to 10%. Now, there's a slight caveat there that because it's a lifetime question, there's reality that the older you are, the greater exposure you've had. But certainly we'd expect that this is also capturing some difference in more recent experiences as well. And then we kind of look at the experience by different ethnic groups. We see that Rangatahi Maori are about 23% have experienced sexual harm in their lifetime, followed by Pacific young people at 18%, European also at 18%, and then Asian is about 11%. And again, sadly, but not surprisingly, young girls are much more likely to have experienced sexual harm than boys. It's about 22% versus 9%. Another gender is also quite high at 38%, but that, because it's such a small cohort in these samples, there's large uncertainty in that, so that we've kind of often had to suppress that in the report. But obviously we just want to flag that is a group that seems to be particularly vulnerable. And again, the rainbow community in general seems to be vulnerable with sexual harm. It's about 29% of young people that identify as rainbow have experienced sexual harm in their lifetimes versus 13% of young people that don't identify as rainbow. And again, similar to physical harm, we see that disabled young people are much more at risk as well. 31% of disabled young people have experienced sexual harm versus 12% of non-disabled young people. And again, youth living in two-parent households also kind of consistently report the lowest level of sexual harm. And then we find a little regional breakdown where we see kind of similar patterns that we've seen in the past kind of topics, that about 19% of young people in Canterbury have experienced sexual harm versus 15% in Auckland and 13% in Wellington.
So yeah, as we talked about at the start, so what we've gone through already was made up the first chunk of the report, which is just those top line numbers, but we used the second part of the report as an opportunity to dig deeper into some of the findings from the survey itself, while also linking it into just topics of interest, research and policy and legislation, just to kind of tell a bit of a story. So the first story is about screen and social media use among young people who have experienced harm. So ultimately, screen use and social media use are a normal part of young people's lives, and increasingly so. They're increasingly relatively embedded in young people's lives. Over half of young people spend at least 5 hours a day online outside of use for school or coursework, so 56%, while about 1/3, 34%, spend at least 5 hours a day on social media. But at the same time, digital spaces can also be a key setting for harm. Over half bullied young people were bullied online in the last year, so 53%. Bullied online, that captures rumours being spread, for example, on social media, and experiencing bullying over the phone or on Messenger, which can kind of tell us that for many young people, although online environments are places of connection, they can also be places where harm can occur. Bullying is associated with poorer well-being and online safety. So young people who were bullied reported poorer mental health compared to young people who were not bullied, 40% compared to 13% of non-bullied youth. Bullied young people also reported were more likely to report poor or very poor sleep compared to young people who were not bullied, so 48% compared to 38%. As I already spoke about at the beginning, young people were, about almost 1/3 of young people reported missing school due to a fear of being bullied in the last 12 months. Bullied young people are also about twice as likely to report feeling unsafe or very unsafe online, 13% compared to 6%, and much less likely to report feeling very safe online, so 19% compared to 30%. Victims of bullying were also more likely to report high or very high screen use. So as I already mentioned, over half of young people spent 5 hours a day at least online. For bullied young people, this high or very high screen use is at least 7 hours a day online, while very high screen use is 11 to 24 hours a day on their screen or on social media. So victims of bullying were more likely to report at least 7 hours a day on their screen, 35% compared to non-bullied young people, 28%, and very high, so at least 11 hours a day on social media, 9% compared to 5%. And yeah, so this is each day outside of regular use for school or coursework. So young people also asked their main reasons for using social media. Bullied young people were more likely to report using social media as a means of coping or escaping their problems, 58% compared to 38%. Bullied young people were also more likely to report using social media to express themselves, or because they felt an urge to, or they were bored or didn't know what else to do, or as a means of reaching out for support, which all in all kind of suggests that for many young people experiencing harm, social media might provide this temporary relief, connection or reassurance, while unfortunately keeping them connected to those spaces where harm is occurring. We looked at this for other digital-based harm. So we looked at this for harmful sexting experiences and pressure to do things seen in pornography. And we saw very similar trends compared to everything that's been touched on so far, which shows that it's kind of consistent in the digital space. So overall, while looking at research and legislation taken into account with these findings, approaches that address online safety while improving the safety, accountability and responsiveness of digital environments are likely to be far more effective in reducing harm for young people most at risk and keeping young people safe online. And we've seen some legislation in New Zealand and Australia that have aimed to reduce this sort of thing. So in New Zealand, we've got the Harmful Digital Communications Act, and in Australia, there's things like the Online Safety Act, as well as the Online Safety Amendment Act. And overall, this was kind of a key reason for looking at the story, because it's a bit of there's a lot going on in this space at the moment.
The second story actually, I think, also shows why we kind of like to do these deep dives, because I guess the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey has a wealth of information, but being a cross-sectional survey, it's always really hard to kind of tease out cause and effect. And so one of the reasons we do these stories is by kind of taking this data and trying to embed it in the context of additional research. We can use that additional research to try to get a bit more confidence about which way, what is the causes reaction of these relationships. And obviously some of these relationships are reciprocal. And so I guess is to actually make firmer conclusions than we can just based on survey data alone. And obviously there's probably many people in this room that are engaging in research that we've basically borrowed from to kind of strengthen this report. So thank you to everybody who's involved in the Academy, because we definitely rely on that to kind of put some meat on the bones of the story that we're putting together. So this story, was looking at experience of harm by young people involved in state care, and also then how that relates to future offending. And that's the side which we really rely on some of that additional research to kind of get a better understanding of. And so when we're talking about young people involved in state care, in the context of the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey, young people are asked if they are currently involved with orangutan mariki in the sense of being placed in foster homes. So they don't survey anybody in residential care who's not going to school. And so that, is one caveat that this is a subsection of all young people in state care in New Zealand. But obviously when we look at this wider research, which looks at a broader range of state care, what we see in the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey really aligns with what the patterns we're seeing in the survey results. And so when we look at young people in state care in the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey, they basically consistently show higher rates of harm and higher risk of harm compared to the general young adult population. And this is true for almost every type of harm we can report, so I won't go through all of them. I'll just try to pick out some key ones. So about 33% have been exposed to physical harm in the home in the last 12 months. That compares to about 11% of the general population. 52% have experienced physical harm from the carer, another adult, or another romantic partner in the last 12 months. That compares to 16% of the general population. And 41% have experienced sexual victimization or harmful sexting, compared to 16%. And 52% have been bullied in the last 12 months, compared to 25% in the general population. And again, we're talking about exposure to violence at home. I guess another key caveat is that the home where they're exposed to violence is not necessarily the home that they're living in when they're in foster care. And in fact, we know that these experiences of violence may be what has brought them to the attention of orangutan mariki and brought into the state care system in the first place. So we're just careful that we're not attributing this higher victimization rate to be in state care itself, but that this victimization rate, this higher level of victimization, might be leading to involvement in state care in the first place. So we know that young people in state care are consistently more likely to experience victimization, and we also know that they're more likely to go on to offend in later life. And research kind of shows that this experience of victimization is probably directly contributing to this higher probability of offending. And so when we look at all young people who are victims, whether in state care or not, we see that they're much more at risk of being trouble in police in the last 12 months in the Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey. So around 7% of all young people say they've been in trouble with the police in the last 12 months. In contrast, about 12% of bullying victims were in trouble with police. 15% of victims of sexual abuse were in trouble with police. And 19% of young people who've been exposed to violence in the home have been in trouble with police. And again, when you look at this wider research context, we see that coming through, that victims are much more likely to go on to offend. And this is, I guess, the idea of a victim-offender overlap. And again, I think research suggests that there's some direct causal links between this victimization and this offending, and that kind of comes through a couple of different mechanisms, such as the trauma of victimization leading to reduced emotional regulation, which is also something we see in Youth Health and Wellbeing Survey, that young people who are victims report lower levels of self-management skills and lower levels of social-emotional skills. We also know that young people who've been victimized are more likely to engage in, say, riskier behaviors such as underage drinking, and that can pull them into activities which lie outside the law. And again, also there can be a psychological impact where younger people who've been victimized are more likely to show traits such as rumination, which can lead to higher levels of aggression, higher levels of violence. And so this victimization, the trauma of victimization, seems to be having a really direct impact on the risk of offending in later life. But one key thing is that offending is not inevitable for victims in state care or victims in general. We know there's a range of protective factors that reduce that risk, and we also know that most victims don't go on to offend. And these protective factors can include a stable relationship with an adult caregiver, good professional support. If they're in foster care, good placement stability, they're not moving around on a frequent basis. Strong peer relationships and school engagement. And obviously these protective factors aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Good school engagement might help bridge stronger peer relationships and good relationships with older adults. And so, yeah, these aren't mutually exclusive, but there's a pattern that kind of comes across. And the research suggests that if we can engage with young people who've experienced victimization, who are in state care, if we engage with them early through early coordinated interventions, the trajectory from victim to offender is not inevitable, it can be changed. And so that's in the report, we kind of give some series of recommendations relating to that. And I guess the key thing is that whenever young people in state care are kind of go on to offend, approaching this through a offence punitive lens is probably going to be counterproductive. That actually there really needs to be a trauma-informed approach to dealing with young offenders, because they almost certainly are dealing with the trauma of victimization, and that will then impact, if you're not dealing with the cause, you're just trying to deal with the symptoms, you're not very likely to get terribly far. So yeah, that was kind of the general thrust of the story.
The Youth Victimisation and Harm Report is available on the Justice website. So you've got the report itself, and then there's five data tables on there with different breakdowns, which have little explanations on the website. And then there's also a link to MSD's website, which obviously that's where the data comes from. So the Youth Health and Wellbeing survey data is on that MSD website, along with their infographic, and then the methodology report, the technical summary, and a lot of the other documentation that's really good to know when analysing our data.
Yeah. And maybe two other things just to add is firstly we have long format data tables, which have a lot of breakdowns. We're also in the process of producing a data dictionary and some just instructions on how to use the tables, just because we've had a bit of additional work come in after the publication. Those haven't been completed yet, but they're on our to-do list. So yeah, we can share whenever those data dictionaries up, because that will probably make the tables more usable, but the tables are now available, and we'll be hopefully getting that additional collateral out in the not too distant future. The other thing is that the whole unit level data set is available to researchers in two ways. Firstly, it has been uploaded to the IDI. About 30-40% of respondents consented to have their data linked to the IDI, and so that means that you have the survey. We can also link it with other admin data sources. As well as that, I think they have uploaded the survey data set, the unit level data set, to Stats Data Lab. So that's available to researchers, and the whole data set is available to researchers in that context, but you won't be able to link it to other data sources. So depending exactly how you want to use that data, there's two routes to working with it. I think Mike and Mike and Anika would be very happy to at MSD to answer any questions about that. Which leads on nicely to our acknowledgements that we've worked very closely with MSD about this. It's been quite a long process. And big thanks to Mike Webb and Anika Terry, who've done a lot of work on this. We're aware of how much effort surveys take, and we've got a decent team of 11 people. They were having to do a lot of work with a smaller team. And also a big thanks to Zoe Tapatakis, who I think has moved on from SD, but did a lot of the heavy lifting at the beginning. We wouldn't be able to produce these results without them. And also, obviously, a big thanks to the participants who were brave enough to take part in the survey and be vulnerable. And we really want to respect the data and use it well, because it is a precious thing to get.